Sometimes the simplest things, like buying a movie ticket, they turn out to be surprisingly complicated.
Oh, definitely. You think they're just paying for the movie.
Right. But then you look at the breakdown, the taxes, and today we're actually diving deep into a legal case that's all about that. Should that cinema ticket have value-added tax, VAT, applied to it?
That's the one. Commissioner of Internal Revenue versus SM Prime Holdings and First Asia Realty Development Corporation. Sounds maybe a bit dry, I know.
Yeah, mouthful.
But it's actually fascinating. It really gets into how tax laws get interpreted, the whole history of taxing entertainment.
And, what it could mean for the price you actually pay at the box office.
Exactly. We're working from a decision by the Supreme Court of the Philippines here.
Okay, so our mission basically is to figure out why the courts ultimately said no VAT on cinema tickets, even though usually selling a service is subject to VAT. It seems counterintuitive.
It does on the surface. So the story really starts with the tax authorities, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the BIR. They looked at SM Prime and First Asia's books and said, hey, you owe the VAT.
For what period?
For SM Prime, it was specifically for the year 2000, and the amount was, well, significant. P 119,276,047.40.
Wow. Okay, yeah, not pocket change.
Not at all. And for First Asia, it was across several years, 1999, 2000, 2002, and 2003.
And the amounts? Similar scale.
Yeah. Around 35 million pesos for 99, another 35 for 2000, roughly 32 for 2002, and 28 for 2003. So add it up. Again, serious money.
Definitely serious money. So the BIR hits them with these huge assessments. What did SM Prime and First Asia say? They must have pushed back.
Oh, absolutely. Their core argument was, look, our ticket sales, that income should be under the amusement tax.
I have the local one.
Exactly. The one governed by the Local Government Code of 1991, not the national VAT, which is under the National Internal Revenue Code, the NIRC, from 1997.
So they're saying, pick a tax, you can't hit us with both.
Yeah.
Or rather that the local tax is the correct one.
Essentially, yes. They argued that only one business tax should apply here, and history and the specific laws pointed to the local amusement tax.
Okay, makes sense as an argument. So where does it go next? The courts.
Yep, the Court of Tax Appeals, the CTA. First stop was the CTA's First Division.
And their take.
They actually agreed with SM Prime and First Asia.
Oh, interesting. Why?
Their reasoning was pretty layered. They looked back at the legislative history, what Congress intended.
Right.
And they pointed to something called House Joint Resolution number 13.
Okay, what's that?
It basically expressed Congress's view that, yeah, only one tax should hit theaters, the local amusement tax.
So direct evidence of intent.
Pretty much. And they also did something else significant. They invalidated a specific BIR issuance, Revenue Memorandum Circular 28, 2001.
Why invalidated?
Procedural grounds, mainly. They said the BIR didn't follow the right steps when issuing it, but fundamentally the CTA felt this RMC was trying to impose VAT where the law didn't explicitly allow it.
Got it. So an RMC is like the BIR's interpretation, but the court said this interpretation went too far.
Exactly. It can't create a tax obligation that isn't actually in the statute passed by Congress.
Okay, round one to the cinema operators. But I assume the BIR appealed this.
You bet. They took it to the CTA on bank. That's the full court sitting together.
Did the full court see it differently?
Nope. They upheld the First Division's decision, affirmed.
Wow. So the entire Court of Tax Appeals agreed no VAT. What was the AM Bank's main rationale?
They focused heavily on Section 108 of the tax code, the NIRC. That's the section listing services subject to VAT.
Right.
They basically said, look, this list is exhaustive. It tells you everything that's subject to VAT in terms of services, showing movies or exhibiting films. It's just not on the list.
Huh. So if it's not explicitly listed, it's not covered.
That was their view. They argued the local amusement tax was the proper one. End of story for VAT.
Okay. Seems pretty clear-cut from the tax court's perspective.
Yeah.
But it still went higher, right, to the Supreme Court. The commissioner must have felt strongly.
Absolutely. The Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the head of the BIR, took it all the way.
Well, what was their main argument to the Supreme Court? They must have disagreed about that list in Section 108.
They did. They argued that list isn't exhaustive. And, they pointed to the language in the law itself.
How so?
Well, Section 108 uses words like including and similar services and shall likewise include.
Ah, okay. Suggesting the list gives examples, not a closed set.
Precisely. And interestingly, the Supreme Court actually agreed with the commissioner on that specific point. They said, yes, the language suggests the list isn't strictly limited.
Oh, So a twist. It sounds like the BIR might have a winning argument there.
You'd think so, right? But then the Supreme Court pivots. This is where it gets really nuanced.
Okay, I'm listening.
They draw a really fine line. They distinguish between the lease of motion picture films.
Which is subject to VAT, right? I
Yeah.
think that was mentioned.
Correct. That activity is listed or clearly covered. But the court says that's different from the showing or exhibition of those films to the public.
Is that distinction really that clear-cut, though? I mean, to show a film, don't you sort of implicitly lease the right to view it for 2 hours?
That's a great point, and it highlights the complexity. The court acknowledged the practical connection but focused on the legal definitions and, crucially, the history of how these activities have been taxed.
Back to the legislative history again.
Exactly. The Supreme Court really dug into this. They looked at how things worked way back,
Like how far back?
1939. Under the old NIRC, showing movies was taxed, but it was an amusement tax collected by the national government then.
Okay.
Then later, the power to levy that amusement tax on cinemas specifically was transferred to local governments through the local tax code.
Right. We mentioned that. The LGC of 1991 kept that local power.
Precisely. And here's a key bit. Even when VAT was first introduced nationally in 1988, the law explicitly exempted businesses that were already paying amusement tax under the 1977 NIRC.
So there was a clear intent not to double dip, even back then.
It certainly looks that way. The Supreme Court emphasized that the legislative intent, woven through all these different laws over decades, was consistently to treat cinema exhibition under the amusement tax regime, not VAT.
Even if the collector changed from national to local government.
Correct. The court felt the type of tax assigned to the activity was the consistent thread. They also pointed out that amendments to the VAT law over the years specifically added film lessors and distributors to the VAT base.
The leasing activity again.
Right. But they never added the cinema operators, the exhibitors themselves.
Okay, that historical context seems pretty powerful. It wasn't just about interpreting Section 108 in isolation.
Not at all. It was about understanding Section 108 within that whole framework of how entertainment, specifically cinemas, had always been treated for tax purposes.
And this also relates back to the idea of avoiding an excessive tax burden, right?
Definitely. The court explicitly brought that up. They calculated that if you added 10% VAT onto a potential local amusement tax of up to 30%.
You're looking at a 40% tax rate on ticket sales?
Potentially, yes. And the court basically said that seems unreasonable. They cited an older case, Roxas v. Court of Tax Appeals, and this powerful quote.
The one about the power to tax.
Yes, that the power to tax involves the power to destroy, and it must be exercised fairly and uniformly. A 40% tax might cross that line.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about the BIR's argument that, okay, maybe cinemas were exempt before, but the LGC of 1991 repealed the old local tax code, so that removed the old prohibition. Did that hold water?
The Supreme Court shot that down, too.
How?
They said, look, just because a prohibition on national taxation might have been removed doesn't automatically grant the national government the power to impose VAT here.
You need positive affirmation in the law.
Exactly. Tax burdens aren't created by implication or by removing old restrictions. The law imposing the tax has to be clear and express. Any doubt goes against the government.
And that BIR Revenue Memorandum Circular, the RMC 28-2001, the lower courts already invalidated it.
The Supreme Court agreed. They upheld the invalidation. They said an RMC can't impose a tax liability that isn't clearly based on the law itself. Since the law wasn't clear about VAT on cinema tickets, the RMC trying to impose it was invalid.
So this leads to another important point, right? SM Prime and First Asia didn't actually need to prove they qualified for a tax exemption?
That's a crucial distinction the court made. It wasn't about exemption. It was about whether they were subject to VAT in the first place.
Because exemptions are interpreted narrowly against the taxpayer.
Correct. But the imposition of a tax has to be clear. If it's not clear you were ever meant to pay VAT on this specific activity,
Then you don't need an exemption because you were never included to begin with.
Precisely. The burden was on the government to show a clear legal basis for the VAT, and the court found they couldn't. Doubts favor the taxpayer.
Okay, so putting it all together, the history, the specific wording, or lack thereof, in Section 108, the potential burden, the invalid RMC, the Supreme Court landed firmly on one side.
Yes. They affirmed the Court of Tax Appeals. The final word was, cinema ticket sales in the Philippines are subject to the local amusement tax, not the national value-added tax.
Right, so the big takeaway, the aha moment really, is just how critical that historical context and legislative intent are. You can't just read one section of the tax code in a vacuum.
Absolutely not. It shows how tax law evolves and how courts try to maintain consistency with long-standing principles, even as specific laws change.
And the practical implication is pretty significant, too. This decision likely kept ticket prices lower than they might have been if cinemas had to pay both taxes.
It certainly avoided that potential 40% combined rate, which would have likely impacted either the cinema's margins or, yeah, the prices we pay.
So it really makes you think, doesn't it? A final thought for you listening. Consider how these seemingly small details, these nuances in legal wording and history, can ripple outwards and have real economic effects on everyday things.
Yeah. How many other transactions have these hidden layers of legal interpretation behind them? It's fascinating stuff if you dig into it.
Definitely. If tax law or the history of how we tax things like entertainment sparked your interest today, there's always more to explore. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.